Okay, here's the first part of the alpine lecture. Mainly going to be covering. This is a good start to the video, huh? When I can't come up with a word of a sentence. Um, so we're going to talk about the conditions that are common in the alpine environment, and then some of the adaptations that alpine plants generally have to deal with those kind of conditions. So when we think of the alpine environment, we're often thinking about kind of four different things um, that kind of provide a stressful environment for plants to grow in. One is temperature. Generally, we're thinking of really cold temperatures in particular. And then anytime we're talking about cold temperatures, we're also talking about the length of the growing season. It can be really short. Solar radiation, we've talked a little bit about this before, I think, where there's high solar radiation loads at high elevation. As the air gets thinner, more of those, especially UV lights, penetrates the atmosphere and actually gets to the Earth's surface. So that can be harsh for plants to grow in. High wind speeds are common, and then high snowpack. And then that kind of translates to water. Like, really, we're thinking about the distribution of water on the landscape and how it's really variable from places that are really dry to places that are like flooded or saturated almost all the time. So so I'm going to talk through these four factors in particular. So here's just a climate diagram of kind of an alpine environment. And you can see, looking at the red line, which is our temperature line, how many months are experiencing below freezing temperatures. And then also remember these blue and turquoise bars that are on the x-axis, those indicate any months that have temperatures where at least one day is below freezing. So that the average monthly temperature might not be below freezing, but it still experiences freezing temperature. So again, our growing season typically is in between these kind of turquoise bars that are on the x-axis. So we're talking about 4 months of a growing season, not very long. Also, high wind speeds occur at high elevation. So you can see these trees, the growth pattern of these trees is in response to the high wind speeds. And also, people are thinking about how to harness the high wind speeds at higher elevations using turbines. Sorry, my headphones are about to get torn apart. So that's just another indication and kind of visual memory of the high wind speeds at alpine environments. And then also the snowpack and distribution of water. The timing of snowpack is highly variable and is impacted in large part due to how much solar energy a particular place on the landscape is receiving. And then once that snow melts, like, where does that water go? And so some places are really dry and some places are really wet. So we're going to talk about adaptations that plants have to these five characteristics: cold, and then short growing season, nutrients. I didn't talk about that yet, but alpine environments tend to have low fertility soils. We'll talk about wind and heat. So let's first, in talking about temperature, talk about the actual temperature that leaves experience. We know it's a really cold environment, but then thinking about the types of plants that grow in an alpine environment, it helps us see, like, if we look at the temperatures the leaves experience, that helps us understand the adaptations that these plants have. So on all of these slides, in the gray box, are kind of the take-home messages from the slide, so you can go back and read that information if it's helpful. So on this figure here, if we look, so let's look at this table here. The very top row is the air temperature 2 meters above the surface, and this is at 900 meters, 2,000 meters, and then just in units of Kelvin for some reason. So let's go to this 2050 elevation. So this is on a fairly nice summer day where it's 20 degrees Celsius air temperature. Then the rest of these are the leaf temperature of different plants that grow to different heights. So this is a small tree, and then going down to bryophytes. So we're talking mosses and lichens here at the bottom. The important thing to notice is that the leaf temperature of fairly tall plants is about the same as air temperature, but the leaf temperature increases the shorter the plant is. in general. There's some exceptions, but generally getting warmer the shorter it is, and that's because it's close to the surface, and the really short plants are in the boundary layer of the surface. So we've talked about boundary layer on leaf level. There's also a boundary layer on Earth's surface as well, and so really short plants are in that boundary layer. And remember, boundary layers act as a resistor to the movement of heat. So it causes heat to move slowly away from an object. And so these plants then, they get heated up by the sun. The heat doesn't dissipate very quickly because of that boundary layer. And so it allows that heat to stay in the canopy and warm those leaves up. And so just another figure to reinforce that. These two kind of diagrams here show what are called wind speed profiles. And so it's just how fast the wind is moving at different points away from Earth's surface. And so at the very bottom here is the wind speed at the surface. And then these horizontal arrows represent the wind speed at each of these heights. And so you can see that the wind speed is quite slow at Earth's surface and then increases the further away you get from that surface. And so these really low wind speeds allow a boundary layer to build up. And so generally speaking, that's one of the reasons we have short plants dominating the alpine environment, is because they grow in that boundary layer. So that's one reason that the leaf temperature of short plants in particular don't experience those really cold temperatures that the air experiences, or that the air is at. Another reason is snowpack. And so here is the temperature. These are time series of leaf temperature of the air, which is this top panel, and then 3 different species. And so if we look at this rhododendron species, we see kind of a flatline leaf temperature throughout much of what are the winter months. And then during the growing season, we see these huge fluctuations. Now these species here and most of the kind of dwarf shrubs in the alpine are evergreen, meaning they keep their leaves all year long. So this isn't the fact that the leaves are gone. This flat line here is the fact that their leaves are covered in snow. So they're under snowpack. And so when they're under snowpack, they don't really experience temperatures much below freezing. They're just kind of buffered from those really cold air temperatures. And that's why we have that flat line. But then once the snow is gone, we see the leaf temperature responding rapidly to changes in air temperature. This species on the bottom actually doesn't grow in areas where there is snowpack. And so, or at least that there isn't snowpack all year long. And so what we see is a high variability in leaf temperature throughout much of the winter. You can see this small area where there was some snowpack and then it melted away and we see that high variability again. So that's one way that plants don't experience those really cold temperatures in the winter, is by surviving underneath the snowpack. And then the other aspect of, or the other factor of leaf temperature is what side of the slope a plant is growing on. So south facing in North America is going to be the side of the slope that's going to get more sun, whereas the north facing slope is facing away from the sun, and so it's going to get a lot less direct solar radiation. So you can see that here where there's plants growing on the ridge, these open symbols. The solid black round symbols are on the south slope, and then the triangles are on the north slope. And so if we look in particular on south and north, the black symbols again are on the south slope, so it warms up quite a bit and earlier in the day than on the north slope. And you can see it later in the day, these plants do warm up a bit, but it's for a very short period of time relative to those plants growing on the south slope. So that has a huge impact on where plants can grow and what the actual environment is they are experiencing. Okay, let's talk about short growing season and nutrients. And I combine short growing season with nutrients here instead of cold, just because the adaptations are similar. So one of the main ones is that alpine plants tend to invest a lot of their biomass in these really large kind of tap roots, which can be really, really long, especially compared to the small amount of biomass above ground. And if you go up to the Alpine Visitor Center in Rocky Mountain National Park, there's a nice display of the entire root system. So it's several, probably two-ish meters deep, a root, and then the above ground tissue is just a few centimeters. And so it's investing a lot below ground. And what it uses those roots for are storage, and storage of two main things: nutrients and carbohydrates. So from a nutrient standpoint, there's very little nutrients in alpine environments. They're a nutrient limited system. But what these plants do is whatever nutrients they do come across, they take up, whether they need them or not, they take up those nutrients, and then they can store them in the root system and reuse those. So it might store nitrogen in the root and then move it to the above ground tissue in the spring when it's growing, and they can move those nutrients back to the root the next winter. And so by recycling these nutrients, it can help them grow over the long time in these nutrient limited systems. They also use these roots for carbohydrate storage. And typically what they do is during the growing season, most of their photosynthate that they fix goes toward storage. So they store a bunch of carbohydrates below ground. Winter comes, they go dormant. In the spring, remember, they have a very short growing season. And so in order to maximize that growing season, what they do is they use carbohydrates from last year to grow their new leaves. So they don't have to wait for it to get very warm or there to be lots of sun. They can start growing those leaves immediately because they already have the carbohydrates to do it. Once then the leaves are produced, then they can work on replenishing those carbohydrate stores. So those large storage organs below ground are really important adaptations in alpine plants. Another one is what's called preformed buds and then thermogenesis. So preformed buds, when we're talking about this, we're really talking about flowers in this particular case. What a lot of alpine plants do is they grow and develop their flowers the year before they're going to use them. But then they keep those flowers in a bud so that those flowers are pretty protected. But the flowers are all ready to go. It doesn't take very long to open them up so they can be pollinated. And again, in this really short growing season, those plants want to get that reproductive process started as soon as possible. So they have these preformed buds, preformed flowers formed inside the buds, and as soon as they can, they open those flowers out, get them pollinated, and they can start the reproductive process. Then some plants can actually generate heat to melt the snow. So this picture here is a species that does this thermogenesis. It's a respiratory pathway, but instead of getting the energy out of respiration, it just releases all that energy as heat, and it causes the snow to melt, and so it can start growing and start the reproductive process earlier by getting rid of that snow before it melts in general. Okay, wind. I'm not going to show anything on this because we really talked about it when we talked about that boundary layer. But that high wind speed, the way to deal with that is to be short. And that's why the alpine environment is dominated by short plants, is because they're short and I messed that sentence up. But ultimately, because of their short stature, they're in that boundary layer. And so they're not going to experience those high wind speeds that taller trees would experience. And then lastly, heat. So when we're talking about alpine environments, we generally don't think of heat as being a stress, but a lot of these plants experience really high temperatures. If we go back, I'm going to go back up to this slide where we've got this leaf temperature of different sized plants. You can see a lot of these plants from the forb rosettes down on a day with 20 degrees Celsius are getting into the 40 degrees C. Well, at 40 degrees C, those proteins in the cell membranes start denaturing and kind of falling apart and losing their ability to function. And so that is a temperature that plants want to avoid. And on a nice clear day, these plants are experiencing that. So alpine plants don't have any special adaptations to deal with heat. Generally, they probably try to cool their leaves through transpiration and keeping their stomates open as much as possible. And that's really all a plant can do. But I just wanted to bring it up because it's not necessarily something we think about. We don't think about heat stress in alpine environments, but indeed it does occur for plants.